Hello and hi everyone. How's it going? I hope you're doing well. I'm doing pretty well because today we're talking about music. We're talking about an album review, and you might notice I got this little scratch on my nose. I decided to start the new year by losing a fight with a box, so that's the energy we're bringing into the new year. So let's keep that going. Hey, let's fight those boxes that we all have in our lives. That said, we're doing a really cool review today. It's a preview was provided to me from Skapunk International. So thank you so much for providing the code as well. I submitted an interview request with this artist. So I will have an interview coming up on a publication I write for called Spring Magazine. I'm going to have the link for that down below when that does get published. It's not published quite yet, but I wanted to make sure I had a video review out talking about the album more broadly and more in general, just to build that hype to get the preview train going. But this is a really cool album. So this is Eevie Echoes and the Locations, the Cons of Being a Wallflower. I'm going to have the over this direction somewhere some images. It's going to be out on a really cool looking vinyl print, which is awesome. But I'm also going to have the purchasing links and social links down below for Eevie, so you can follow her on all that social media. Okay, so let's get into the album. So Eevie Echoes and the Locations, band based out of Brooklyn, New York. Cons of Being a Wallflower is the debut album as a band, as a unit. Comes out January 10th on, like I said, Skapunk International Records. Who is this for? If you are a fan of Hole, if you are a fan of ska punk, Skacore bands like Joystick, We Are the Union, punk bands like the Distillers, kind of the thematic and emotional and even musical elements of Against Me and Laura Jane Grace. This is totally your album. And I'm going to get more specifically and do a track by track breakdown and how that comes across. But my initial note, because I was kind of writing notes at different stages of the review process, I wrote, it's a mix that feels really refreshing and cozy at the same time, like an energized nostalgia that's equal parts pleased and pissed to be at your New Year's party. Does that make sense? That makes sense. I think that makes perfect sense. And I probably don't even need to say anymore, but I will, I guess. So who's in the band? So we have Eevie Echoes on guitar and vocals, Emma Taylor doing guitar, vocals, and piano. We got some piano here and there. Carmen Castillo on bass and vocals, and Nick Grasso on drums. There's a few guest musicians as well that we'll get to. What is covered on this album? A lot. The first thing that struck me were the lyrics. Usually when I listen to an album for a review, I just put it on once in the background just to sort of get a general idea of the kind of music, maybe what bands does it remind me of, what does it sound like? And I couldn't do that. Even with the first track, I was like, wait, that sounded important. Let's go back to that. And I've had it on repeat. It's such a great album. So we cover the topics of breakups, politics, trans rights, and the kind of emotional journey of transitioning, dealing with manipulative people in relationships, relative to kind of parental relationships, mental health struggles. There's a really cool track that it sounds like mental health struggles, and if you've been through that, it makes sense, like somehow, and I'll get to that track specifically, but like the sound of disassociating, it's captured musically in that, which is really cool. So in June 2023, Eevie released the first single Liar and Letters You Wrote. Letters You Wrote is a great song, get to that too, as the first singles for the album with the current lineup. And then the track Brain Dead was just released January 3rd. In that track, so that's one of the ones that talks a lot about mental health. They collaborated with queer chiptune artist Crystal Cartridge. So you got that kind of chiptune aspect in that track as well. So on the album, I was provided a press kit. So there's a really good quote that I want to read, kind of setting up the album itself. So on the Cons of Being a Wallflower, Eevie says, they tell the story of a girl who's just coming into herself for the first time, who's in this very raw state of being freshly out, and who has to navigate a post-quarantine world. She simultaneously wants to be seen and loved, but also has experienced the repercussions of what happened when you live as a visible out trans person. It's not sunshine and rainbows. It's scary and leads her to find unhealthy ways to cope with the feeling she's having. She learns to love who she is in the moment and commits to growing and changing for the better. you see that journey on the first track of the album all the way through to the last track of the album. And I think that's sort of where you do get that Against Me, Laura Jane Grace influence, not just because of the similarities of being a trans woman, but sort of the narrative framing and that very open, honest storytelling of the album as well. Um, Really cool thing. So her hopes for the cons of being a Wallflower is that the album could be for someone coming out their way, someone out their way, their ordinary life by We're the Union, or transgender dysphoria blues by Against Me, or for her. It's very special to Eevie that this influence is coming full circle because, and here's what I've got this still in here, Reed Wolcott from We Are the Union was actually the mixer for this album. So that's really cool that if there's someone that's influenced you so heavily in your life and you look up to them, that you actually get to then work with them professionally. And I think that's such a cool idea. I've had times in my life where I've gotten to do that with some of the artistic things in my life. And I think when you get to do that musically and then you get to kind of show it out there for the world, that's such a cool thing. So congrats for that, I think. So let's get into the album specifically. So it's got that Against Me sort of whole influence. It's 90s grunge, but through the lens of skapunk and skacore. Some of the tracks are more overtly skapunk and skacore, but I would say generally everything sort of has that almost like bubbling into the surface as a secondary genre. There's also a bit of post-punk on here as well, and I think that comes out in the production, just the way the levels were sort of chosen. It's sort of that, not wall of sound, it's like a muted aggressiveness. Does that make sense? That's sort of how I would describe the mixing on that. It's really cool to hear. So you have 10 tracks on the album. The first track, so that was the one where even right away I was like, okay, let's backtrack. We're going to have to pay attention. The lyric was, wasn't this pressure to have your whole life figured out and a career at 24? Oof, too real. 24 is the name of the track, Growing Pains of Capitalism. It's a good ska punk number, good ska punk opener, I think. Then we go to Brain Dead, which is like a jaunty, uppity, musically tune featuring the chiptunes artist, Crystal Cartridge. It feels like it could be on the Scott Pilgrim soundtrack. And I mean that in a good way. So if you don't like that soundtrack, don't take that as a negative. It just feels, it's got that sort of fuzzy indie rock post-punk feeling to it. And I like that a lot. Really good lyrics. The third track is Liar, and we're bringing in that grunge, that whole influence on here. It's angry and pissed. You get a bit of that self-hatred and self-loathing, and it's being put forward outwards, and I like that a lot. Track 4, Helicopter Parent, really, really personal take on unique relationships. So it's on a very specific topic, but it's really, really well communicated. I think if that's a story that you've had in your own life, I think you'd relate heavily. It's written well enough that you can apply it to different situations in your life. But I think, has that been a parental relationship that you've had or a caregiving relationship that you'd have? You might relate really heavily. Apathy, which, having done the interview, I know is actually her current favorite track on the album, has a really fuzzy instrumentation. And this is the one that, to me, musically emulates what apathy feels like, what being withdrawn feels like. That's not easy to do, to use instruments to portray the theme of the song you're trying to put forward. That's really cool. Then track 6, Letters You Wrote. It feels very, very theatrical. So I think that's a bit more of that Laura Jane Grace influence on sort of the later Against Me work, the way that kind of goes in that direction less. The punk is there because we build up to the very climactic finish, but you get that slow piano build, which I really, really like. Track 7, Users. That's a really good song for anyone that's also been through manipulative relationships. And that could be in a parental situation or caregiving situation, that could be among friends, could be among lovers. It applies to, sadly, a lot of situations. And it's an angry song that musically feels suspicious, and you get that grunge influence again. Track 8 is Murder Me. That's another kind of grungy, pop punky number. I really like the lyric, I need you to murder me so we can make some memories. That just feels like a grunge lyric to me, and I like that a lot. Number 9, Promise/People Pleaser. So Promise is sort of the opening and the closing, the frame for the track, and then People Pleaser is sort of the middle. So as someone I've gone to therapy to talk about people pleasing and sort of that nature and the roots of that. Where does that come from? So this track certainly hit some elements that are heavily relatable in my own life story. And it's really cool. Again, it's sort of theatrical. Like we've got that frame, like I talked about. Um, Very, very different example. But if you think about Pink Floyd's Animals, how we sort of frame the album with smaller acoustic numbers, that's I don't want to say that this album is similar to Animals by Pink Floyd, for better or for worse, but that same framing with acoustic numbers at the beginning and the end we get on this track, and that's really, really cool. And then track 10, Odd Man Out, it's a perfect ending because it feels like a synthesis, sort of like I said at the beginning of the review, it's a synthesis of where we go from the beginning of transitioning and sort of putting yourself out there and coming out. And what does that mean with the relationships you do have? What does that mean with new relationships you have? And how do you cope with that new anxiety? And how does that impact old anxieties? There's a lot of questions raised. Some of them don't get answered here. Some of them just remain and we have to sit with them. Some of them do get answered here and we find joy and community and wellness. And that's just a really good way and relatable way to end the album. It makes you want to loop back to the beginning and apply the frame that we're given on this last track to the rest of the album. Again, I think what I've described here really showcases some really strong songwriting capacity because you can just write some great songs, stick them on the album, call that your album, people will like it. But to pay really close attention to the sequencing, to play really close attention to what narrative am I providing to people, it feels really powerful. And that's a really cool skill. So I think who is this album for? Like I said, musically, it's for people who are into skapunk and skacore, but I would say even more so people who are into that post-punk and grunge kind of aspect, but maybe want to branch out genre-wise a little bit and try something new. And that's how I would describe this album. For people that want to try something new, it sounds different. It sounds like its influences, and it's not necessarily even mushing them together. It's taking those influences and applying a new lens to them. And that's really cool. And I will again provide a link to that interview when it is up and published, because then you'll get a bit more in-depth ideas behind the songwriting process, who Eevie is as a person and forming the band, as well as what the go-to bodega order is. That's a very important question. But otherwise, I think that's the album. Check it out. Purchasing links down below. And once again, pictures in this direction somewhere. Maybe I'll put the picture. That's a hob, the xenomorph. These are Knights of the, oh, that's Knights of the Slice. Anyway, toy collection video another time. Catch you later. Bye.